What's up, comrades? Welcome to this week's episode of Red Library, a political education podcast for today's left. We have a brand new, icy cold, spicy hot collaboration coming your way with our excellent podrads over at the Cosmopod from Cosmonaut magazine. Your trusty host, Comrade Adam, a.k.a. Chairman Bane, has gone mobile and joined Remi and Niko from their Ecology Cast series to read through Kohei Saito's Capital, Nature, and the Unfinished Critique of Political Economy, Karl Marx's Ecosocialism, published by Monthly Review Press in 2017. Now, this is a very special episode for yours truly because I just wrote a review on Saito's excellent book for Houston Review of Books. Big shout out to our comrades over there. So this is really an opportunity to explore Saito's work more in depth on the show as well as in printed form, which you may have already read. We're going to talk about the concept of metabolism, Saito's salvage project on Karl Marx's systematic structural critique of the ecological devastation wrought by capital across the globe. We'll talk about some of Marx's influences, his sources in agricultural chemistry and agricultural physics that led him to completely and radically reshape his critique of capital, which we're only now beginning to understand. We'll have some good live shit posting along the way, some critical reflections, and we'll even engage with some of the more recent critiques of Saito's work from people like Slavoj Žižek. This episode is especially an important one for Red Library because we've gotten a lot of requests to do a specific work of Marx and Engels throughout the show's history, and we have always denied those requests. Not because we don't want to, but because we like to do things that most people don't cover on the show. I'm happy to say that this is perhaps exactly the kind of work we do want to cover if you're interested in learning more about Marx and Engels' work, precisely because it is a bit novel, is a bit different than what you might typically find, and it is a radical critique and perspective on Marx's legacy, which we are going to find out is actually a living, breathing thing, and it is hotly contested even to this day. It's an unfinished project, let's say. Let's run down our typical housekeeping that we do each and every show to let you know how you can support Red Library if you like the work that we do, if you value it, not just as exchange value, but also as use value. If you'd like to support the show materially, head over to Patreon and find us there. You can find a link in the show notes, but you can also just search www.patreon.com/Red Library Podcast. For as little as $1 a month, you can get access to all of our premium content. That is at least one patron-only episode per month. We're going to be doing more than that, though. Access to our special Discord server where you can get involved in the discourse. Mwah! You can join in our reading groups, help plan and participate in special roundtable discussions, which we release to patrons only, and all sorts of amazing critical reflection, debate, thought, discussion, all that stuff. We're working on getting up to our goal of 100 patrons, which I'm happy to say we are only 5 people away as of this recording, and by the time it comes out, we may have surpassed that goal. So big shout out to all of our brand new patrons. We love you, we honor you, we pledge our fealty to you. Your names shall echo through eternity. Well, at least the leftist podcast version of eternity, whatever that is. If you're in the Twitterverse, remember, find us on Twitter, follow us there, like Red Library on Facebook. Remember that Red Library is part of the Lost Horizons Podcasting Network, a collection of shows focused on developing the dialectical pessimist perspective. That includes us, our podrads over at the Regrettable Century, and From 78. Remember, we have a monthly roundtable discussion with a varying cast of characters from all the shows talking about all sorts of things related to politics, philosophy, psychoanalysis, and all that other good stuff. You can find a link for that in the show notes, or just search on your favorite podcasting app. Well, here we are still, after all. And last but not least, just keep passing the show around. Enjoy the show this week, y'all. It was a hell of a lot of fun, and we're looking forward to more collaborative work with our podrads over at Cosmopod. We'll see you back here afterward. This is a joint collaboration. It's a hot jam. It's a hot joint from Red Library and the Cosmopod cast from Cosmonaut magazine. So this is Comrade Adam, a.k.a. Chairman Bane from Red Library. I'm here representing from our crew tonight.
I have to go mobile.
Hey, it's Niko from Cosmonaut, Ecocast, resident ecologist, engineer, communist.
What up? It's Remi. I am the inveterate anti-intellectual in the crew, so I'll be asking the dumb questions. You know that.
Listen, someone's got to be doing the dumb guy shit on the episode. We always need one.
Always. I have to warn you, I'm an idiot savant.
Listen, as long as there's some savant aspect to it, then you can be as much of an idiot as you want. all voices matter in this podcast tonight, as I was just saying a minute ago. I know that y'all, this is for your ecology series. It's funny, whenever we first were kicking around the idea of doing a show together, we had talked about a couple of things, but Kohei Saito's book, Capital, Nature, and the Unfinished Critique of Political Economy, otherwise known as Karl Marx's Ecosocialism, was kind of the one that we ended up going with. And I guess for a number of reasons, which we'll talk about, but the more that I've gone back and reread this book and tried to organize my thoughts around it, I realized that this is part of y'all's series, but for our series, I think that this actually fits into our sort of Lost Future series that we've done, which could encapsulate anything from a history of socialist Yugoslavia to the rise and fall of Arbenz in Guatemala. So for me, this is a really interesting and unique sort of shared interest, I guess we have, that maybe we think about it in different ways, or we're coming at this from different ways. But the overlap between what y'all are doing and then I think what we're doing in this particular series is really enormous and was kind of unexpected. So I'm super excited to be able to participate and collaborate on this with y'all.
Absolutely. Honestly, it's kind of funny. We've been launching our ecology sub-series. Like we've been, kind of prosecuting that angle for, I don't know, I guess a couple months now. Niko is an ecologist, and he's also absolutely a fucking nerd. And a total shut-in around this Marxist ecology shit, which, like, honestly, I couldn't be happier about if he would just finish paper he's writing for us. But other than that, I'm totally thrilled because this fits in, like it seems like a glaring hole in a historical materialist approach to history and to society, right? That like, oh, well, you considered everything except for man's relation to nature. And of course, like, as we discussed in our Metabolic Rift episode, Foster's Marx's ecology. Actually, as a matter of fact, that's not the case. And even though it's not one of the most developed aspects of Marx's work, he does clearly just place society's metabolic relationship with nature as like a center of his dialectical worldview. So long way of saying I'm completely thrilled. One of the first things I thought about when we were planning this series out was a crossover with you guys because you do it so fucking well. So thrilled to be here.
Yeah, well, I mean, the feeling is very mutual. And Niko, I have to say, I am really excited to get to talk about this book with y'all because, just to shamelessly self-plug, I wrote a review of this book for the Houston Review of Books, in addition to another work. And I guess the only thing I can really say is in terms of my credentials to approach sort of topics of ecology and ecosocialism, besides just being a frothing at the mouth communist, is I took one of those what are your leftist political values quizzes the other day, and I got eco-Marxist. I don't know if that stacks up to Niko, to your credentials, but whatever I lack in scientific knowledge and expertise, I'm going to make up for in just sheer fanaticism today. That's my plan.
Hell yeah, I think I got that same result actually. Eco-Marxist.
Oh yeah, eco-Marxist, rise up.
Hell yeah. But I mean, yeah, I'm so excited to actually cover this after like doing our first episode on Marxist ecology. I mean, this is the sort of spiritual successor. And I was kind of worried that if we started with Foster's work originally and then go on to more, we kind of like missed this entirely. But this gave us a kind of like excuse to backtrack. Yeah, I'm really excited. Like this is like a really, I think, fascinating work that just it builds upon everything that I think Foster was trying to do in that first book. And just, with this, mounting kind of like publishing of that mega collection of these, journals and just archives of Marx Engels works, just really like developing this further.
As a kind of point to get us into this as well and to contextualize it within the episodes that y'all have done, Saito's book published 2017. And I thought, for Red Library episodes, we usually like to start off with thinking about what is the context of this work? Like, why this work? Why did we pick this versus anything else? And since we're talking about Bellamy Foster's work, and I know we've been sharing some resources kind of leading up to this, I kind of wanted to maybe start with just having a discussion around maybe defining the metabolic rift or defining metabolism, because we're going to draw on that so heavily, and Saito's work is going to be building on Bellamy Foster. And maybe just to sort of think about, for y'all, your interest in this work in particular, considering the episodes you've done so far.
Time to go mobile.
All right, the podcast has officially started. There's been a Bane line.
I'm going to punt this one to Niko, because not that I don't have any thoughts about it, but honestly, my Marxist ecology is fucking infantile. It's an infantile disorder compared to Niko's. So I'm just going to let that go on.
Oh man, I feel like, Atlas here, but in like a less like Ayn Randian sense. trying to
Wah, wah, wah. Take on, look, we have to imagine Sisyphus happy. So I'm imagining you happy and talking.
Oh yeah.
To use our Lacanian language, we're trying to mobilize your desire, Niko, to explain and talk about this stuff that you love so much. As I'm gathering from listening to the episodes that y'all have done.
All right, my mind is melting from the psychoanalysis side here, but I'll do what I can for, I guess, the more biophysical dimension. Metabolism, in the kind of clearest sense, is just understanding from the almost physiological approach, coming up from early ecology, this sort of consumption, excretion, the interaction between the organism and the environment, an open kind of flow system thermodynamically, dissipative structure in Prigoghinis's terms. I think really getting into this, though, kind of flushing more in the background here for what Saito, I think, kind of sees it as. In his most recent work, actually came out last month, I want to say, about the metabolic rift in the 21st century. He builds upon also Marx's work, obviously, Foster's work, but also he draws upon Istvan Mazaros's work, and he really conceptualizes here as this first order metabolism being the social metabolism of humanity on nature, and putting, I guess, these three terms forward. You have the universal metabolism of nature, this kind of flow of flows, if you will, these various nutrient cycles, energetic flows, etc. And at the same time, you have human society, which is the social metabolism that, through labor, mediates man's relationship with nature. These two metabolisms in place, you have very basic base superstructure idea, I guess. What Saito is really conceptualizing this as is this, kind of second order mediation of the social metabolism by capital, or the logic of the predominant mode of production. So, in essence, the social metabolism of nature, being driven by the logic of capital, undermines this sort of flow of flows, these natural cycles in nature, whether it's, the nitrogen cycle, or it's, metabolics of the food chain, as we start fishing down the food chain and removing pretty much the most important species in these ecological systems. So you see how human society starts to, under capital, the logic of capital driving this, undermine these processes, causing this metabolic rift in Foster's terms. I guess that's the clearest sense I can try to explain, these things metabolically.
You get maximum air horns for that. That was fantastic. That's super helpful for me to think about too, because whenever I thought about why this book was a particular interest for me, I think maybe the key driving point of interest to read this book versus any other was, I guess, specifically around the historical political theory aspect of what Saito is trying to do, which we talk about sometimes on Lost Horizons episodes, is like a salvage project. So I see that for me, this is in a way Saito historically going back and trying to reclaim a certain lost future, let's say, in Marx's own work. And so I guess one of the things that we've been discussing has been typically Karl Marx's eco-socialist tendencies, and correct me if I'm wrong from what y'all have read so far, are typically seen as being kind of vague, a little disjointed. Maybe they're not really developed. They're kind of nascent within the work of Marx and Engels, more particularly Marx. And Saito's project here, at least whenever I've read it, really strikes me as him drawing on recent publications of the new collected works that they're putting out in English, but also the Mega in German, and really trying to go back and with more sources of Marx's canon, letters, manuscripts, everything else, trying to show that not only is an eco-socialist critique systematic and clearly defined within Marx's critique of capital, but Saito's claim, I think, is a really radical one, which is that it is the primary point of critique and the primary leveling of the analysis of capital that you see developing, I guess I would say, very particularly from the mid to late 1860s onward. One of the things I'd be interested for us to talk about is some of the critiques of Saito, or maybe Saito's own responses to people like Moore, about this debate over how systematic, how clear was Karl Marx's eco-socialism. Because to me, that's what interests me about Saito's project, is it's very clearly saying, no, this is the core of a Marxist critique. It's just that we're only now having the resources to be able to fully conceptualize that and flesh that out.
I think that's correct. And I think it goes to, you have certain contributors in this renewed ecological Marxist tradition, like Malm and Moore, but to a greater extent mom, who want to extrapolate even from a single line in the Goethe program, or the fact that Marx, extrapolated from soil analysis of Russian peasant communities. They want to take that sort of limited oeuvre of evidence and extrapolate from that into asserting like a really systematic focus on ecology on the part of Marx. Whereas like one thing, we recently did Jason Moore's work, Capitalism in the Web of Life, on our podcast. And one of the things that comes through for me in that is this idea of historical nature, and this idea that a scientific socialist and historical materialist project is inextricably going to be bound up in exploration of a regime of metabolism, a metabolic social regime, not simply a social regime. And so I think that ties in, with Saito's work very well. And I think that he expands upon it, right? That we're not merely talking about political economy, but we're talking about, as Moore would have it, the dividing line as far as what constitutes capital N nature. Because, and as an example, to use Moore's formulation, right, behind Manchester lies Mississippi, meaning that the dividing line between what was nature and what was society was permeable at that point, meaning was at a different goalpost at that point, so that African slaves were considered nature. They were exploitable nature in the same way that coal is still, or oil.
So while I want to defer sort of the kind of discussion of, the critics of, Saito, or this kind of like position of Saito's work within the sort of like, world ecology, metabolic rift, monthly review school debates, I do want to say, this book, I think it impressed me a lot. I had moved on from, I thought, Foster's original work on Marxist ecology, and gone on to working through Moore and other ecosocialists who are trying to do, I guess, more modern critiques, trying to see how they approach these things. Still very much, drawing upon Foster's original formulation. But this book, I think, really showed me that Marx's work itself still had a lot more to give to this kind of modern synthesis, even, I think, to Moore's project itself. In this sense, this work, although Capital remains an unfinished project, really shows this sort of evolution of Marx's thoughts, and really puts, I think, to the grave this kind of like attacks on Marx himself being Promethean or anti-ecological. Although I might disagree to some extent of how systematic this kind of thought was within, Marx's works entirely, I do think this really does lay the groundwork for the sort of analysis that is necessary for ecological Marxism in the 21st century.
I think that's a good transition point. So real pro podcaster move there, Niko. Well done. Into maybe the content and the introduction of the book. For me, I think one of the most interesting and kind of relevant aspects of Saito's historical deep dive and like salvage project that he's engaging in, I think, is to counter some common stereotypes and misconceptions, I guess, about Marxist critique of capital, and certain attacks or trying to smear Zaddy Marx by saying he is really still trapped within this kind of Western European Enlightenment Promethean view of progress and technology as being able to overcome all natural limitations, is inherently anthropomorphic in its basic assumptions about the nature of capital and political economy. I think one of the things that you posted right before we started to record today, Niko, also like really spoke to, there's a similarity between this work and another work that I'm a big fan of that I've actually talked about quite extensively in different places on Red Library, is Kevin B. Anderson's Marx at the Margins. I was curious, have you all read that book or are familiar with its analysis or like sort of construction of Marx's critique?
I read the synopsis, but I have not read it yet. It's on my list after reading this book and seeing it cited in so many reviews and similar like discussions of this work.
That book is around spot number 358 on my reading list, which means it's in the top 1% of books I intend to read.
That is high praise indeed. Just to very quickly kind of summarize, I think its similarity to Saito's work is that Kevin B. Anderson is really going back and starting in a lot of Marx's lesser known journalism work, and like through the 1850s and into the 1860s and through Capital and up to the end of his life, trying to show that Marx's thinking about colonialism, the destruction of imperialism, of capital's quote unquote civilizing influence, that earlier in Marx's life, maybe you could level a charge of like being Promethean or sort of like very still trapped in these like Western European Enlightenment sorts of assumptions. But, Marxist thought is something that was always evolving, always expanding and kind of looking at new things and pretty radically shifting in terms of what his basic critique was or where he placed the sort of like Archimedean point to critique capital from. And so I think that for Kevin B. Anderson, his work is trying to show that Marx's understanding of, again, the sort of victims of imperialism, whether it be India or even looking at places like Poland and Ireland, that his thinking shifted on this really significantly throughout his life. And so one of the things we have to kind of think about is critiques of Marx being Promethean, being, again, trapped in these sort of like Western European anthropomorphized sorts of assumptions might only really even be applicable, if at all, to Marx of the Communist Manifesto or of the 1844 manuscripts. And so, this is like big Marx, nerd shit, but I do think it is important. There's implications to how we think about the history, and dismissing Marx as if he stayed trapped in those assumptions, again, is actually to simply cut Marx off at the very earliest point in the development of his thought. And so we're trying to, look at the whole entire development of Marx's thought as much as we can at this point, and to really go back and question and critique whether these assumptions and critiques that people level at Marx are actually accurate.
I think that this kind of, to me, clearly mirrors this idea of Althusser's that there's an early Marx and a mature Marx. And even though it doesn't actually assert that, right, it does, to me, I don't just merely want to repeat the idea that, it's Marx's method that's important, not Marx's contributions, because I don't actually believe that. But I would say that historical materialism, as formulated by Marx and Engels, whether or not they explicitly expounded upon this dimension, implies ultimately a hyper-focus on the ecological relation between human society and nature. And again, I want to emphasize, right, like whether or not they explicitly laid that view out, that is implied in the historical materialist outlook and method. So like, at the end of the day, once historical materialism is carried on beyond Marx and Engels, that it has to include a focus on the ecological relation, because it is, in fact, one of the defining parameters of social relations and the social totality.
So this actually brings up a point in the introduction I wanted to talk with you all about as well, which is the way that what Saito talks about as the first stage eco-socialists, people like Michael Louis, people like Andre Gors, and the second stage eco-socialists, which are, maybe we'll include John Bellamy Foster and maybe others. I'm going to rely on y'all to give me a more comprehensive idea of who would fit into that category. But Saito starts off this critique by really looking at the current debates around Marx's eco-socialist tendencies or how to think about this, and kind of has some pretty sharp, incisive criticisms about how especially I think first age eco-socialist sorts of thinking, there was this idea to dismiss Marx as being irrelevant or, again, being trapped in these Promethean sorts of ideas. And so we need to jettison Marx completely if we want to think about eco-socialism. And Saito really seems to be kind of trying to historically and systematically completely wipe out that critique. And so maybe one of the things, we'll talk about is sort of what are the implications of that if we now take Saito's project as fundamentally, returning to Marx in a new way from this kind of eco-socialist perspective. I mean, one of the ways that I took his work is trying to make Marx this living, breathing figure of an eco-socialist, Marxist ecological sort of perspective. Whenever I think about encountering other people talking about ecology and eco-socialism, I was trying to think about how often do I hear people talking about Marxism as being a necessary part of that critique, or is that something that typically we encounter that as at a point where Marx has already been jettisoned? Do you feel that outside of the academy, Marx is kind of seen as being typically so outdated that there's nothing that like a Marxist specific critique has to say about climate change and ecological catastrophe and all the rest of it?
If I can give like a funny story, I think I mentioned it possibly in our first episode, but I still recall vividly, being like, I guess, a brand new Marxist going into university. Now that I'm done, I can make these jokes about myself. I remember like my freshman year, I got into this graduate seminar on systems ecology, and they said you choose a topic on this, and I'm like, I'm gonna try to do leftist theory with ecology. The only person I could really find was Bookchin, and I feel like I made a total ass of myself. I could never go back for I think 2 years after that.
Google Murray Bookchin.
But then in my junior year of university, I was talking to one of my ecology professors. Actually, we're doing climate change ecology, one of my major interests. And I was trying to explain metabolic rift to him, and I just felt like I hit this wall trying to explain these ideas. And I've been trying to, I think, apply these ideas throughout my entire undergraduate experience, whether for more like a almost biogeochemistry dimension, or kind of trying to bring together all of these directions metabolic rift school has gone, whether it is like the systems ecology approach and fisheries in the oceans, whether it's the kind of faithful agriculture critique of Marx as we previously knew it for this book. And I always hit this wall, I felt like. But this book here, I think, really puts us right on the path of actually recognizing, first of all, the limitations of this sort of 1800s science and criticism thereof prior to this ecological crisis. But it really, I think, gives the foundation through what we'll later discuss, Fraas and others, and also seeing Marx's method develop in real time in response to, even the kind of top scientists of his day, especially Justus von Liebig. So I'm excited to get more into that.
And here's one thing, it may be a hobby horse of mine, I'm sure it is, a sort of a complex systems theory or cyberneticist approach to historical materialism as like an evolution of dialectics, which is what I kind of think of it as, right? Is that like systems theory is sort of like the grounding and systematization of dialectics in a scientific way. We come to realize, at least in my opinion, I think Saito does a good job of elucidating this for us, that the social organism can only be understood in a frame of reference with its external environment, right? So like I kind of hold fast to an idea that a system is defined and structured by what it does in the world, and this kind of like activist epistemology that like a system not only structures its environment, but it is structured by it and the reciprocal pressures that it receives by acting within it. Whether or not, again, it's explicit in the work of Marx, we can go back, as I believe Saito has, and we can pull out the implicit implications that a social system, a social organism, is bounded and defined and structured not only by its own activity, but by the reciprocal intervention of the environment in which it's operating.
Yeah, and I think for Saito, one of the other things that struck me as really crucial here is that whenever we think about Marx's critique, his eco-socialist critique, whether that's as truly systematic as Saito claims, or whether it at least, is fractured but still there, the real kind of radical move here is to shift from this sort of critique of Feuerbach, which is really defining Marx's early thinking, especially around the 1844 manuscripts, but starting to understand that we have to look at the specific social forms and the material basis within the environment, within nature, which sort of mutually reinforce and shape each other in the systematic, quote unquote, dialectical, air horns sort of way. Yeah. So I like that. That's almost like a sad guitar riff also. So I like the idea that air horns and sad guitar riff are kind of very similar in my mind. But I guess the other thing too that really strikes me as really important in Saito's reconstruction of Marxist critique is that you have to understand that metabolism isn't something that really only became relevant or really this particular relationship of humanity to nature only came about in the Industrial Revolution. It's that metabolism and these processes have always been key in how human societies relate to the material basis of their social forms and production. It's just that they've always had to be rationally managed in a particular way to be sustainable. And capitalism itself, because of the abstracted forms and social formations it depends on, such as money, abstract value, which we're going to get into, these particular social formations override the ability to rationally manage the process of metabolism between humanity and nature itself. For me, that was kind of what I really took from the introduction, which is him systematically saying, here's kind of my general argument, here's what we're going to do, was really trying to show that this process of metabolism is not some novel development, in the 1700s, 1800s, but it's kind of always been there. It's just that capitalism tends to push it into this hyper-destructive, self-eating, irrational sort of way that we still really don't know how to deal with outside of, again, obviously, communist revolution of some kind or another.
And this may serve as spoiler or whatever, but like, the big revelation here, at least for me, once you take a historical materialist view of social metabolism of nature, is that these systems are not actor and actant, right? Like they're not the actor and the acted upon, they're co-constitutive. So what ends up happening by necessity is that once, and this is drawing from Malm, but also from Moore, right, is that once you de-link production and accumulation from, I forget the specific term for this, but essentially animal effort, animal labor, whether that animal be a human or something else, right? You unchain that process from reference to the confines that had previously been there. And you create the appearance, right, that the energy being pumped into the circuit of accumulation is infinite. And we have escaped the bounds of the necessity for labor to create, concrete effects in the world. But really what you're doing, right, is creating a carbon-based economy that's unchained from the same reference that were in power in previous modes of production. So that has its own particular both ideological effects, but then also biophysical, climatic, and social effects.
For sure. I mean, this sort of, social metabolism is, transhistorical. We are always, mediating our society through, nature itself. The whole maxim, we are part of nature. I mean, this is one sense that, very much it's a truism. I think going on in a sense, though, too, is like what Saito kind of explains, too, is in the same sense as what Foster kind of went against with the original, Schmidt, the concept of nature in Marx conception of metabolism, which they ascribed to Molschat and other sort of like mechanical materials at the time. He really starts to, I think, with the help of Mega, explain that Marx's conception of metabolism itself isn't just like this sort of, passive usage, whether drawn from Justus von Liebig himself or from these, kind of scientific materialists, mechanical materialists at the time, but rather this, sort of developing trend from this shift originally from this Feuerbachian conception of human essence and natural essence. And that the whole quote about the essence of the fish in the river and the river being polluted, I just love that as like a sort of like kind of pivot from this abstract conception of essence and species kind to really getting into the actual structural forces that are causing environmental degradation, allowing human society to exist as mediated by labor. But this, social metabolism as mediated by this sort of social formation, the dominant logic of our mode of production, that's where you start, really getting this critique here and just seeing Marx develop it from this early time period in response to like this sort of, abstract essence to this actual, biophysical kind of approach. This is where this book shines.
And maybe on that note, we can kind of move into chapter 1 and start working through Saito's reconstruction of Marx, starting with the economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844. I guess one of the ways that I read Saito's book is kind of in this tradition, or in a similar vein as how whenever new publications of Marx's writings, manuscripts, letters, unfinished drafts, things like that get published, it's very easy and maybe historically common for different ideological camps within Marxist thought writ large to sort of draw on particular texts to kind of give them ammunition for putting forward their own critique, their own interpretations, usually for very specific political struggles, and to stake a sort of theoretical claim for their particular position or approach to how we answer certain political questions or how we deal with the larger geopolitical situation that we're in. So in 1844, or I guess one of the things, Remi, you kind of mentioned a little bit about Althusser and the sort of the epistemological break, as it's typically called, which is this idea that there was this earlier period of Marx where he was very influenced by Feuerbach and was very focused on almost, let's say, quote unquote, humanist kinds of concerns about what we call species being, or this like focus on alienation. And at least the typical story of this goes is that this was early Marx, a sort of intellectually immature Marx, but then he shifts over to more of a scientific, historical materialist kind of approach, or dialectical materialist approach. But, again, Althusser wouldn't necessarily talk about dialectics per se, to really focus on the sort of scientific aspect. For anyone that isn't familiar with this history, I think it was, do y'all remember when the manuscripts were first published? Was it the 30s or was it more like the 50s?
I believe the 30s itself, although the Dialectics of Nature, too, was published in the 30s. or late 20s, early 30s in the Soviet Union as well. So it's like a lot of these works, I think, fueled these kind of two different sides of this view of Marxism and nature, as we'll see with Western Marxism. But, I think at the same time, I'd also kind of like bracket to like the kind of development of the publishing of Dialectics of Nature in the Soviet Union had this immense effect on the ecological debates happening there. And there's actually a connection with Fraas in that book, Engels' work, but we'll get to that.
So I guess kind of maybe the early chapters and Saito in this first chapter in particular is trying to reconstruct how exactly the publication of the manuscripts really, again, like provided fuel for a particular kind of Marxist humanist position in the early to mid 20th century against, let's call it, Stalinist orthodoxy. Typically, the idea is that Marx really kind of moved on or, shifted from this earlier kind of focus on alienation and this humanist kind of conception to kind of more of a focus on, let's say, like naturalism or scientific sort of investigation. Saito is really trying to go back and say, what we're looking at here in Marx's early writing and his shift to, let's say, economic and philosophic manuscripts in 1844, to the Communist Manifesto, to, let's say, the publication of Capital Volume 1 in 1868. We're not seeing so much a sort of break per se, but we're seeing a kind of shift or an evolution of a single stream or a single tendency of thought that just sort of takes a new form. He's really kind of focused on trying to deconstruct this idea that there's a humanist Marx versus a scientific Marx, and really tries to show that kind of both of these are continuous and assumed throughout all of Marx's work. And I think he's trying to use the publication of the Mega to sort of support his claim that this is actually an ongoing sort of development of a particular tendency and not so much of a break, I guess.
My brief contribution to that is that in a different podcast called the Radical Thoughts podcast, where we go through Verso's Radical Thoughts series, I actually don't, after study of Althusser's claim and the other like sort of supporting interpretations of this idea, I personally don't buy it. I don't think there is an epistemological break. I think there's an evolution of historical materialism. I think that there is an organic whole with emphasis placed in different areas of that historical materialist whole.
Either of you happen to listen to, this is like way back in the RL catalog, but they're the episodes we did with the Regrettable Century on Russell Jacoby's The Dialectic of Defeat?
Yeah, I listened to that. That was one of my favorite series that you guys have done.
Yeah, me too. But one of the things I love about that is whenever Jacoby basically is like, well, whenever you actually look at what Althusser said about the epistemological break claim after the fact, he said it once and then immediately was like, yeah, I was wrong. I just said it.
Yeah, exactly.
I think that sort of conception of this epistemological break a la Althusser was very alluring in the past, but I think this book, again, shows through the method of Marx himself and his kind of development in response to philosophers and scientists, it's not as convincing.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think Saito's work really, in a much more historically grounded way, just kind of reinforced, from that Jacoby book that we read, that very particular sort of critique of how, the idea that there's this epistemological break, maybe isn't as solid as it seems, but it sure in the hell has been utilized to kind of be a very effective cudgel against certain interpretations of Marx, which usually, have, in the 20th century at least, have very clear political agendas, behind them. So there's a materialist way we think about why we interpret certain philosophical claims in the way that we do.
Can I add something about that?
No, you cannot.
No, God damn it. And you're going to the gulag.
Nah, banned to the gulag.
It seems like structurally similar to the effort. So if you read, Helena Sheehan wrote an excellent book called Marxism and the Philosophy of Science. And in it, she pays a great deal of attention and emphasis to the effort to paint Marxism, particularly Western Marxism, as suffering from an artificially construed break between Marx and Engels. Like basically this idea that like Marx had the good ideas, but Engels, popularized them in an incorrect way with like a bad and mechanistic and vulgar sort of way, right? And that was used as a way to create this idea that, Engels was responsible for corrupting the works of Marx, which led to dialectics of nature and Lysenkoism and all these ideas, right? Essentially what it served to do for these people, whether they realized it or not, but in my opinion, what it served to do was to create this alibi by which Western Marxism was not responsible for Stalinism. And the reason it sought to do that was because of the historical era through which the people who sought to do that lived. And so it was almost this way to like cop out of Stalinism. But what it actually served to do was to create an artificial division in Marxism and in, dare I say, the science of historical materialism that actually wasn't there due to political pressures that were present at the time. And she did, I think, a pretty good job of showing how, like, in fact, this is not the case. So the thing I'm trying to say here is that it's analogous to that similar, like, artificial painting of a division, like the attempt to paint an early Marx and a mature Marx as these two very, like, qualitatively different, philosophically different, theoretically different things. It rings similar to me, and I don't know what the reason for that would be. There's nothing as concrete as, oh, well, there's Stalinism that we have to account for. It's nothing that concrete, but it does remind me of that.
Top fire. I'm definitely going to read that book. I've been really interested in that particular radical thinkers batch of books that they put out, so I'm going to put that up on the top of my list. So
I don't want to give like a spoiler here, but Saito actually tries to argue that there is a split between Marx and Engels due to this ecological approach. Even drawing from the same resources, like, with Fraas's work, you see this kind of divergence of this conception of, the natural metabolism and this kind of critique of technology as this book goes on from Marx. You instead see this sort of almost, still kind of think lingering perhaps Prometheanism, although in the sense that Engels sees much more so, just the rational kind of planning of society can go beyond this like anarchy of the market. But he still goes into sort of like, revenge of nature. It's only a matter of sort of knowing these laws. It seems to me a lot more through modern science than anything, rather than really understanding this historical and almost like evolutionary Earth history time of human civilization and really understanding how natural processes work. It becomes much more in Engels' sense, this encyclopedic, almost consequentialist, or sort of the revenge of nature, I guess, the argument there is not as robust or sort of in dialogue with Marx's later works. But personally, I think the only real Marx is in the notebooks of 1878 on geology, so I'm starting my next sect on that.
Oh yeah, sign me up. Let me know whenever y'all have your first general meeting. I'll be there.
Be making a cult, bro.
I mean, aren't all leftist sects really just cults in one way or the other? Spicy takes here tonight.
Structurally, yes.
Yeah, I've been part of those cults. I can verify.
Me too, bro. The same one that you were.
Why am I not shocked by that at all? Okay, well, maybe just to get to some of the stuff about Fraas and Liebig and some of the things that we're talking about, I want to just kind of cover pretty briefly Saito's reconstruction of the Marx of 1844 and where this break with Feuerbach and the evolution that he sees as necessary in advancing his materialist critique is going to happen. So I think one of the interesting things that Saito mentions is that whenever we think about Western Marxism or Marxist humanism or whatever we want to call it, that the reliance on the 1844 manuscripts typically emphasized the philosophic elements, but also were pretty limited and flawed in their interpretation because they specifically kind of occluded the economic aspects of the manuscripts, things on like ground rent and everything else. So I think Saito has a really good corrective to anyone who is super sympathetic to the early manuscripts and their kind of more Marxist humanist implications, because again, Marx even there is trying to hold both things at the same time, right? This sort of philosophical element, but also this economic, more sort of materialist element as well. But he does say that in Marx's early thought, we do still have to talk about alienation, but in the standard interpretation, he kind of lays out, I think, really succinctly the four different types of alienation, or the four elements of alienation that Marx describes. So just for real nerd hour shit, I'm just going to lay these out really quickly. So these are typically, again, four types of alienation. In early Marx, we're talking about the estrangement from nature as one, humanity from itself as engaging in the world through the act of labor as the other, from our species being, the idea that we're sharing these sort of like, dare I say, universalist kind of elements with all of the humans, and the estrangement of humanity from each other. So basically, I think he has a really great, straightforward way to say that these four types of alienation really equal to a loss of reality, impoverishment, dehumanization, and atomization. So for me, I thought Saito really impressed me with just how I think succinctly he boiled those down to think about alienation isn't just one thing. It's kind of these four different things if we're relying on the early manuscripts.
I think that rings very, maybe not prescient isn't the word, but, descriptive of the period through which we're living as a way to kind of like contemporize those things.
I think one of the other things that I found really interesting too was Saito's sort of emphasis on saying that if you only focus on the philosophical aspects of the manuscripts and neglect the material relations and social context of the alienation, it's sort of inevitable that you're only going to reach a kind of what he calls a philosophic answer to the problem of alienation. I don't know about y'all, but I run around in various leftist circles, and I do think that this sort of humanist interpretation of Marx or socialism writ large is something that is still, I think, very present and very alive in how we think about Marx. So to me, I think that one of the things I really appreciated about Saito is, one of the things we talk about on the Lost Horizons Network shows is sort of trying to reintegrate or to rediscover a way to, say, recombine or rebridge what we call, or what Ernst Bloch called, the cold and warm streams of Marxism. And so through a lot of the 20th century, whether that's a false dichotomy or not, we typically tended to see them as one or the other. It's scientific socialism versus Western Marxism. But I actually think one of the things that Saito is really doing here is reconstructing historically the fact that Marx never separated the streams, let's say, or broke the streams, that they were always there. They just evolved in new ways.
Yeah, I mean, for sure. What he kind of says in his book on his paper on metabolic growth in the 21st century is that this sort of metabolic approach, as it's kind of been reconstructed, allows this bridges beyond this, closed system of historical materialism, this more like, Marxist-Leninist scientific socialism, as well as this sort of Western Marxist trends. So I think that's really, what this book does. It's great. It's really great.
I don't know. I lean on Cauldwell a lot for this, Christopher Cauldwell, right? He has this notion that part of all class society, obviously not just bourgeois society, but perhaps its most refined and developed expression occurs in bourgeois society, is this subject-object divide, and that it has its material mirror in the dichotomy and the opposition of the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, and that neither can find its full expression or complementary realization under capitalism, and that is part of the communist project. I find that really well expressed, this idea of a cold and a warm stream, right? Like, it has descriptive validity, right? Or analytic validity to some extent. But I feel like it almost looks past or looks behind the idea that the marriage of the two is the project of scientific socialism, right? Like, I know that sounds super heady, but that is how I think about these things.
Just to make sure I understand, so the idea is that in scientific socialism, it does inherently integrate both streams, and it doesn't necessarily see, there is some sort of, let's say, humanist, aesthetic, mystical kind of approach to Marxism, a sort of moral, liberatory kind of approach to Marxism against the scientific socialism. It's that both of them are sort of included in a scientific socialist perspective.
I'll animate Cauldwell's corpse from 1920s Spain to do this for me. But essentially, his approach here is that class society in bourgeois society, in mature capitalism, it separates the bourgeoisie and their various kind of like the cartel of classes that they create, which would include, what some people call the professional managerial class, what other, and also the petty bourgeoisie and all the various kind of like attendant classes that are included in this particular regime of class society, right? It enables them to have I guess what you would call like a life of the mind, unfettered access to scientific inquiry. But what happens is that by virtue of limiting that to the class which does not apply itself through labor upon the material world and instead is left to theorize in the abstract, that what happens with that is that there is an ineluctable, unavoidable limitation to that, right? So that, you have one class which is left to abstract inquiry and philosophy and the arts. But because it's divorced from labor, because we live in this society riven in two, in a traumatic wound, a cleavage, as he calls it, that from the life of the vast majority of our society, and because it's predicated on the suffering and exploitation of that majority of society, that it can never achieve its final goal, which is the goal of bourgeois science, which is to finally comprehend social reality. And like, that's where I find Bogdanov interesting, not to fully endorse every philosophical claim that Bogdanov makes, but this idea that the proletariat is deprived of theory and philosophy and science, but the bourgeoisie is deprived of material interreaction with the social world in which we live. And so until the cleavage is healed, until that scar has healed over, that we can never realize our true humanity.
So what you're saying is we live in a society.
Basically.
I was also going to say society has progressed past the need for the subject-object dichotomy. That's another way I would describe that.
That's another way to say the same thing. I was trying to elaborate on how Cauldwell put it, but I think that I mean, I don't know, maybe I'm just talking a bunch of bullshit, woo-woo bullshit, but like, I do think Cauldwell got somewhere, and we have to, I think, also allow for the fact that he was in his 20s when he was killed fighting the fascists in Spain. But I do think that like he's one of the more inspiring Marxists I know of.
It's an interesting way to think about it, how, again, this sort of, in some ways, like the two streams might more be speaking to like a traumatic rift, a traumatic fracture within society itself about division of labor and class structure of society as a whole.
Right, that the humanist project cannot be realized without the scientific socialist project, but that the scientific socialist project similarly cannot find the essence of its object of inquiry without its being fully ingrained into you know what I mean?
Yeah, I actually really like that way to think about it.
If I can take like a bong grip here and say, like, in essence, what sort of, I think, dialectical biologists' tendency to of this understanding the object as subject and object. In the same sense here, with Marx, I think as you go towards the end, you start to reconceptualize the sort of, society, nature, humanity, nature dialectic, and start understanding no longer, I guess, interactions with Liebig, no longer just, soils or nature itself as this sort of, just sterile, static substrates, but rather understanding these like kind of natural forces, this active processes that occur within nature. So I think that kind of subject-object approach and going beyond it does have some validity from more, I guess, biological, ecological, whatever you want to call it side.
Also for doing lots of drugs too. This is how we do Red Library. We just fire off shit talking. It's live shit posting in the middle of the deep theory dives. That's how we do things.
Oh yeah!
I wrote in the review that I did for Houston Review of Books about this that, this reads like a PhD thesis. And so I think there are really strong points about that, but then there are also like really weak points. Again, it is incredibly thorough and incredibly systematic. So I'm just going to kind of summarize maybe the last kind of really key point I took from chapter 1, and then we'll move on to in my notes, what I literally wrote down is, let's get that metabolism, Bays. So before we get to that, I think just to kind of really delineate sort of our discussion about Saito's conceptualization of what is typically called the epistemological break, whenever Marx breaks from Feuerbach, or sort of, again, deeply influenced by Ludwig Feuerbach, but sort of moves beyond him, is that, I guess in Feuerbach's sort of critique of religion and the way that sort of humanity's essence, its abilities are sort of alienated from itself and placed into this abstract realm of a sort of deity figure, that Marx's critique of this, or sort of shift from this, was where he saw Feuerbach and the other young Hegelians as kind of opposing essence to appearance in this sort of process of alienation, but they didn't really investigate the specific social relations that bestow an objective reality onto the appearance itself. This is like real nerd hour shit here, but I do think, to me, this is still always what has struck me as most radical and important about Marx's critique and his method, is how things appear to us in a certain way, and the real critical move is to understand what are the objective conditions that allow this appearance to appear as reality itself. I think that Saito's reconstruction of this is actually really helpful for me to think about, like, why did Marx not, again, sort of engage in this epistemological break per se, but really kind of engaged in a different kind of questioning, but was still theoretically continuous with this sort of like this Feuerbachian kind of approach, which is to say that we are alienating ourselves into these abstracted realms. And again, not breaking from that per se, but really saying, yes, we have to accept that, but then also really dive into what are the objective material conditions that give that appearance its apparent validity. Saito really kind of tries to locate this within Marx and Engels writing the German ideology. So he kind of sees that that's really where this process starts to really take hold and really be very thoroughly expressed in the project of both of them.
I think this point here, you start going from this sort of like abstract conception of nature where it's, just kind of extrapolated from things that currently exist, try to find this essence of nature to really beginning to understand the sort of historicity of this humanity-nature relation. And, generally like how social relations mediate that structurally. That's, I think, what I really saw as like this, okay, this is how we are pivoting from this, philosophical understanding of like natural essence or human essence to actual historicity of concrete relations that are conditioning each other, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I actually think the idea of it being a pivot point is really, I think, a great way to conceptualize it. For Saito, starting in the 1850s, we're seeing new conceptualizations within the realms of chemistry and physiology start to stimulate these new developments in Marxist thought about labor being the point of mediation between humanity and nature. And then obviously, we kind of talked about this at length already, but metabolism is going to be the primary one that Saito sees as really being the core concept that Marx is going to draw on to really, maybe not like in a one-to-one way, but kind of in this homologous, logical sort of way, describe the interrelations, the sort of dialectical mediation between humanity and the material world of nature itself.
Yeah, and you're really seeing this taking up of Marx, of this idea of metabolism, not again through Liebig or through Molschatz or to the other like mechanistic, scientific socialists of the time period, but rather, this guy is still sort of mechanistic, but rather the Roland Daniels, his work on microcosmos, he's trying to apply these kind of developing conceptions within physiology and kind of the precursors to ecology of this, metabolic interrelation. And I think it's really interesting too is like he doesn't, differentiate between the sort of animal or mental metabolism. And he doesn't really give any room to the sort of like kind of vital force. Marx still slights him as being too mechanistic, but he starts taking up this idea of metabolism, and he doesn't take again passively from Daniels or through Liebig or to the other time period, but he starts developing these two ideas of the kind of material metabolism, the Stoffwechsel, as well as this kind of like form metabolism, Formwechsel, this transformation of material and transformation of form. Yeah, do we want to talk about that, or?
I would like to talk about that. I also kind of wanted to get y'all's thoughts about this as well. So I think Saito really sees that for Marx, that nature can't be treated as the separate entity or sphere from humanity, and that humans are also part of nature. And he has this great quote where he says that, quote, nature is man's inorganic body, unquote, which is mediated through labor. But the thing I was sort of curious to ask you about, and maybe, this can kind of tie into that a little bit of what you're saying, Niko, is that Saito lays this out as Marx sees that there's this disillusion of an initial unity that transforms into the loss of freedom, alienation, and enslavement of one's own labor under the sort of abstracted, reified forms of capital. I know we're going to, we've talked a little bit about Zizek's critique of Saito's work and this sort of like humanity-nature dichotomy. But what do you think about this idea that even in Marx and for Saito himself, there's still this dichotomy between humanity and nature that's being created? Even if we say, okay, well, yes, like humanity is part of nature and nature is part of humanity, but we're still creating a dichotomy.
I guess we'll get to Zizek's critique later on in this, but I think what Saito kind of argues is that there's like some Cartesian dualism here, but it's not a bad kind. I still think I stand very much by Moore's critique at this sort of like kind of dualist framework of humanity and nature, rather than seeing this sort of separation. I still think that's a very sort of philosophical concept that doesn't have as much of a almost ecological basis. And I bring back the same conception as I mentioned in the Moore episode for our podcast, this understanding of how organisms themselves modify the environment, and organisms that modify the environment can also cause these sort of catastrophes for themselves. So I don't still and again, I probably articulate better, is that, it's no longer a matter of, this sort of animal nature, two separate spheres, but it's constantly interpenetrated, interrelation. It's asymmetric in that sense, nature always has the upper hand, but these things, the animal's modification of the environment isn't in a vacuum, but at the same time, I'm not sure how to articulate that better.
I mean, it's you like one of the most difficult questions imaginable. So I think you did a pretty good.
You're an idiot, Niko. You don't have the answer.
God damn it. Yeah, I mean, I think analytically, the sort of society-nature dualism has some usages, but I'm not sure how much this kind of separation here works functionally. That's why I stand more so by more.
Yeah, that's understandable. I think that I would weigh in on the side of Malm here, which is an unpopular viewpoint in the circles that we run in that from a philosophical standpoint, I think that monism on this question is entirely justified on a kind of like ontological standpoint, but that I agree with Malm in that an analytical dualism is going to be necessary. And I actually think that not just on a theoretical level, but on a political level. So that many of the proponents of both a philosophical and a political monism are necessary, right? That the idea that we grant agency to coal or to bacteria or something like that, right? Like that may be true at an ontological level, but to paraphrase Malm, right? The solution here may in fact require both hammers and sickles, and therefore it's going to require a certain amount of anthropocentrism, that our ontological commitment to monism and to sort of like a commitment to indifference between entities, between substances ontologically might not allow for.
I think we can also kind of counterpose this too. Saito mentions kind of Molschott's monistic understanding of human functioning as just one element in this eternal cycle of matter. And he faults him for this sort of really abstract ahistorical sense of this, monism and humanity's place within it. There is some extent that, these two analytical categories are functionally useful. When you get lost into this sort of just holism that obscures any ability to actually distinguish how humans are changing these processes.
You both are actually speaking to a really important big brain energy sort of thing to keep in mind, which is that we can have ontological monism, but also have analytical distinctions, which I think sometimes is completely glossed over and has the effect of creating what, Wittgenstein would say, kind of keeping us as flies trapped in a bottle, where we're not aware that we're using different languages or sort of starting with different presuppositions. So I actually think that's a really fascinating way to talk about it, and it's complicated. You both did I think a pretty damn good job of laying out the distinction.
Well, we have the Adam seal of approval. That's no small thing.
Right. The big other has validated you. You are both valid subjects now and continue enjoying as you see fit, as long as it is under my regime of authority.
Well, now that I want that, now I'm going to act in a way that makes you disapprove of me because I want your approval.
All I want is the Darude air horns, okay? That's all I want, so...
Now you'll never get them. You're going to act in ways that make sure you never earn air horns again.
The real Lacanian radical move, Niko, that you've just stepped into is you're going to get the object of your desire, but it is going to completely destroy your subjective experience whenever you hear it on the recording. I'm just warning you. Well, just in the interest of us getting to the real nerd hour shit on stuff.
God, yeah, we need to.
Yeah, I'm going to just kind of burn through the rest of chapter 2 really fast. So again, we're talking about Marx starting to make the shift, this pivot point, kind of what you were saying, Niko, around the German ideology. Saito really describes that his ecological critique isn't present in 1844, but he starts to close that gap very quickly. He shifts from this kind of philosophical focus that humanism equals naturalism, the idea of species being, which is kind of really what's implied there, to shifting towards a conscious regulation of physiological metabolic exchange between humans and nature by, and this is the key phrase, associated producers, abbreviated air horns. So Marx at this point, because of that break with Feuerbach, is really saying that there needs to be this dual focus of study. So we have to think about political economy as a method, as an approach to study the social forms and economic categories of capital. And we also need to rely on natural sciences for the material qualities and the physical sphere that sort of underlie those social forms. So this is where he really sees we're going to understand the objective reality that sort of gives the appearance in Capital of the abstracted, sort of alienated forms, like kind of their validity or what makes them appear as just being reality itself. I know we kind of mentioned him, we're going to come back to him, but metabolism is first used in Liebig's book on organic chemistry and physiology in 1842. Saito's really trying to go back and reconstruct that Marx was absolutely reading Liebig and how he sort of changed his perspective on Liebig throughout his development of thought. One of the things I found really interesting for Saito is that he says that Marx's use of metabolism focused not just on quote unquote enjoyment of the individual, but also in the sort of processes of consumption and digestion, sort of related to individual enjoyment, but also in the context of material and mental production on a social scale. And he kind of sees this as the way that Marx is trying to unify these particular and universal elements, or sort of the abstract and the concrete. But yeah, we've talked about Fraas quite a bit, which we're going to come back to, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that just yet. But I guess that at this point, Saito really says that there are sort of three uses of metabolism as a concept until Marx's work in Capital. And so one is the metabolism between humans and nature. Two is the metabolism of society as a whole. And then there's also the third, which is metabolism within nature itself. So for me, I thought that was kind of a helpful way to talk about how this sort of idea of metabolism is actually kind of this evolving concept that Marx is interacting with in different ways.
I think that's really interesting, right? And that was new to me. I had kind of had an artificially simplistic view of metabolism where society as kind of like a unitary social organism metabolizes nature and produces its waste and so on and so forth. And those two things together constitute each other, right? But like actually the complexification there of humans metabolize nature, humans metabolize humans, the humans in nature, humans in society, right? Like that whole thing kind of complexified that entire schema for me to the extent that it kind of meshed with me with what I learned in More, or first like really conceptualized through More, in which various like social forces, right, like various classes or in some cases races within society become naturalized as in, you know, that's a natural resource to exploit the same way that we would exploit a forest. That was an interesting insight to me. So in a way, right, there is a difference between expropriation and exploitation, so that the classical proletariat is exploited after it's been expropriated, but there is still expropriation of labor. And maybe the classical example would be of slaves in the United States. So that has been deemed a natural resource to be exploited and expropriated. Whereas the labor of people in industrial centers in, I don't know, Chicago in 1870 is to be exploited. That's an interesting distinction to me.
To me, I think this speaks to one of our common phrases across some of our shows, which is that it's much more interesting and complex than that, comrades.
Yeah, I was going to say that too. That's kind of like first appearance of metabolism is in the London Notebooks, as Saito points out. And he says, actually, this is prior to reading Justus von Liebig, although he does think that, you know, it's a sort of mixture of sources. So he can't really say when Marx necessarily first read Liebig, only when he took notes upon Liebig. But, you know, this sort of first appearance of metabolism is more so about this kind of appropriation of producers within, you know, pre-capitalist and capitalist societies. And, you know, this sort of ways of organizing metabolic interactions with nature. This sort of, I guess, appropriation, exploitation dialectic itself. And then, of course, as I mentioned before, this sort of physiological conception of Roland Daniels, who was a colleague of Marx, but was much more into the mechanistic, scientific side. Although, again, to his credit, he didn't lapse into vitalism or too mechanical of a interpretation, but used metabolism to understand not just animals, but humans in their, you know, animal and mental metabolisms.
So maybe just some final points on this chapter so we can kind of keep moving on. I think Saito really pretty succinctly kind of lays out that the idea that Marx sort of supported or thought that there could be this abolition or like abolishing of natural laws under capital is just, again, like a complete limited and fairly, you know, inaccurate reading of Marx. And so he has a couple of notes about how even in the Grundrisse, Marx is already beginning to theorize that economic crises are based on capital's inability to completely master nature, and sort of the relation of those to disruptions in social and natural metabolism as a sort of, let's say, unified process or sort of total process. He does say that Marx does talk about universal exploitation of the world transforming nature for the first time into an object of humankind, and kind of makes nature purely a matter of utility and sort of destroys the old ways of life as well as nature as the great civilizing influence of capital. So he does speak to that a bit, but also says that the idea that you could ever transcend all natural limits, which sometimes is a view that's attributed to Marx, is essentially whatever he did say about that. He said that it can only be achieved ideally, not materially. And even with technological developments, it expands capital's ability to extract and exploit more natural resources, but by doing so, it deepens its own contradictions and exacerbates its exploitation of natural resources and brings about greater crises. So I thought this was really crucial, is that even what we're talking Grundrisse, so we're talking like mid 50s to like early 60s in the 1800s, we're saying that, again, just that Marx is already like conceptualizing that we have to take natural limits into account. And it's precisely the sort of destruction of our ability to rationally understand those limits that is defining of capital's exacerbation of crises through the increasing exploitation of the natural world.
Well, and I think this is important in that, and this goes back to this idea as to whether Marx was Promethean or not. And I think Prometheanism is misunderstood. And I saw this presented to me the other day where I was talking to somebody about a Promethean ecosocialism, and they said, oh, that's a contradiction in terms. I don't think it is. Under the organization of society based in capitalism, sure, that's true, right? Like our works are going to have to undergo a race to the bottom in terms of costs to promote profitability. However, what I think that this says, the bigger message that this says, like, saying what I just said is a banality, that of course, there's going to be a race to the bottom. However, in a communist society, or even perhaps, a high stage of socialist society. So this idea that Marx had this unreasonable Prometheanism, which really translates to developmentalism with no regard for the external, extra-human environment, right? I don't actually think that that's the case. I think that part of what he was pointing out in the Grundrisse and elsewhere is that it is one of the fundamental contradictions of capitalism that it is unable to create and sustain a mutually sustainable environmental posture, right? So that this notion that nature is the external body of mankind, I don't necessarily take as Marx's actual view on the matter. I think that a part of what, whether or not Marx himself thought so, but part of what historical materialism points to and posits is that non-human nature can't be treated as merely an inert substance for the exploitation of human society, whether that society be socialist, capitalist, or feudalist, or anything else, right? It seems to me that what he's pointing to is that a communist society would, rather than doing degrowth or rather than doing hyper exploitation of environmental factors, but instead would an abolition of that subject object divide that views external nature as object.
Yeah, definitely. And I'd like to add too, you can't conceptualize this Marx's, I think, possible earlier Prometheanism. I think Saito kind of like brackets it too. It says like, he might have shown some Prometheanism, but, as he develops onwards, this is not the case very clearly from his notebooks and later writings. But you can't separate, I think, too, like his, number one, this hopes for social society, freely associated producers being able to actually, push us onwards to this better world, but at the same time, this sort of criticism of Malthus and the sort of, as we get into his critique of ground rents, this pessimistic view of this sort of Victorian society mirrored into the natural world, this diminishing returns, this struggle for existence. Marx, I think, very clearly is trying to not fall into that just because of how it limits possible society in the future, And at the same time, I mean, like, these scientists are pretty optimistic. You have the development of these disciplines, obviously, for Justus von Liebig, fertilizers and sort of like mineral theories and sort of agricultural chemistry more broadly. These sort of ideas that you can, through technology, transcend this sort of, in their view, anarchy of the past and, these sort of blind elements of nature. I mean, you still have famines going all throughout Europe at this time period. I think it's understandable to some extent that Marx might have internalized through this, what previous eco-socialists might have thought as an unfinished critique, and then, or sort of a looming, I guess, failure to go beyond this critique of Malthus. But here we really do see, like, as Marx continues to develop his theories, this conceptualization of how these sorts of technologies and even the personal identities of these scientists, including Liebig as a capitalist selling these fertilizers, and further back, the relation of previous human society nature relation, how it's not this just blind, regard for ever-expanding technologies or, total disregard of material limits. He still definitely does see these limits here, but it might be more in the backseat due to, this optimism of the day, and again, this ongoing debate against Malthus.
I think it might be a good point to move into the chapter 4 on Liebig and Capital. But before we do that, since it seems very relevant, I had mentioned to y'all kind of in our discussion leading up today, I was reading Mike Davis's Late Victorian Holocaust. And there's a really, I think, fascinating section in there on Malthus and the discussions about overpopulation and what would give fuel to social Darwinism in the mid to late 19th century, because those famines that were happening were, catastrophic in India, in Brazil, in Southeast Asia, and regions of China. We're talking like 15, 20 million people dead. And those numbers are probably even pretty conservative. And it wasn't to say that within the certain stratified hierarchical class societies of those particular locations that overpopulation wasn't happening. It's just that you can't place overpopulation as the sort of determining factor of why those famines and that massive, massive loss of life happened. And so I think that there's a similar thing that kind of we're discussing here, which is that the importance of Malthus or the influence of Malthus as the sole explanatory mechanism of those famines as being overpopulation is severely, severely limited, and obviously has a certain sort of like political bourgeois implication of what it's putting forward. So I think that's one important thing, just to talk about the sort of wider global historical and political context at the time. But also, Niko and Remi, I think you both kind of really encapsulated this really well, that there's this note that Saito has where he basically says that ecological crises are not due to insufficient technological development, which would be, again, some sort of misattributed claim of Prometheanism to Marx, that if we just had technological development, we could eliminate these crises. But it's really about the economic form determining the sort of trans-historical process of metabolic interchange between humans and nature, and just, again, completely pushing that into this abstracted, reified realm. Again, it will push us to the point that it's almost as if the only thing that would stop it is the complete destruction of human life. But the sort of immiseration of human life, it will continue to push us into accumulation well past the point of immiseration, to me, which was sort of like a kind of a really key thing here. So again, just to recapitulate, it's not so much about technological development will save us, it's that the economic form and determinations of that through the sort of technological emphasis and the abstracted reified forms of capital really disrupt this metabolic interchange to the point that it becomes hyper-destructive and irrational. It's kind of, I guess, maybe a straightforward way to summarize it.
That mirrors the fundamental Marxist point, or historical materialist point, that the mode of production and the relations of production will come into such incongruity at some point that via the motor of class struggle, a revolutionary, a ruptural change is inevitable. And the most recent period that we have lived through has called that into question, much to the benefit of liberals, not to mention reactionaries, right? So but I do think that at the end of the day, the maxim of Rosa Luxemburg's is more applicable at the present and in the preceding era than it ever has been, even when she wrote it, which is, the alternatives are socialism or barbarism, or that is to say, it can result in the common ruin of the contending classes.
Yeah, and I think it's, again, important to stress like this, the dynamic kind of development of Marx's criticism of this like technological determinism or optimism. He's seen even these sort of agricultural scientists at the time, these chemists, whether it's Liebig in Europe or the American Liebig, as Marx calls him in in America's Johnson, I want to say. This sort of optimism they've had is like just slowly, like almost just collapsing in real time as they're seeing these sort of irrationalities of just American agriculture, and of course, as Liebig starts seeing this sort of, robber agriculture. But Marx is like in real time, I think, reading these things, trying to really understand, number one, disprove Malthus. Number two, understand through this metabolic approach how necessarily capitalist metabolism is causing this destruction, this irrationality. And as this goes on, he starts really developing this critique of, capitalist developed forces of production, technologies, even of science itself.
So maybe on that note, we can actually go ahead and move into chapter 4 on Liebig and Capital. A couple of quick notes that I wrote down. I think it'd be interesting to hear y'all sort of kind of expound on these, is that through this sort of referencing of the mega, like we've been talking about, Saito was really trying to say that Marx did come to recognize natural limits and began to argue for this sort of rational metabolic relation to nature through transcendence of capital's reified power. And, he has some discussion about Ricardo and Ricardo's theory of ground rent, which, just for the sake of time, I won't kind of dig into too hard. But talking about Liebig, since we've already mentioned him, and these debates in agricultural chemistry and nitrogen depletion, kind of sees that Marx's interest started to focus on non-proportional increases in soil productivity, talking about the possibility of technological improvements, but it was in the context of a critique of Ricardo and Mills, but still recognized limits placed by geographic and natural conditions. So sometimes, again, this idea is that Marx talked about technological limits could transcend all natural boundaries. But Saito was saying, you have to understand he was only really talking about the technological ability to transcend those certain historical limits in the context of these debates, which I think is so easy to miss in Marx, of how he was actively participating in these debates. So maybe to talk about Liebig and sort of the idea of the robbery of soil fertility, destruction of life for urban and rural workers. Niko, I was sort of curious to hear your thoughts about, if you want to just lay out a little bit of what Liebig's sort of perspective was and Marx's critique, I guess sort of drawing on that, but then eventual critique of that and shifting over to Fraas. This might be a good pivot point for us as well.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think you really see, first of all, we start laying out Liebig's kind of initial critiques, and what Marx really picks up on him too. He's studying Liebig in relation to these non-proportional increases in soil fertility, rather than just this kind of proportional or diminishing, in the sense of Malthus's and other Ricardo's conception of soil fertility. So here you see Marx is reading Liebig to understand, okay, how can we, through this newly developed kind of mineral theory in agricultural chemistry, how can we continue to maintain through, first of all, previously, increase in productivity through technological advancements, but then you start seeing, wait a second, this isn't always happening. Why is this not happening? And through reading Liebig, he gets this actual scientific basis to not only discredit capitalist metabolism, but also to start conceiving of a rational usage of our agriculture itself. So I think, again, where the strength of this book is, it doesn't kind of, start from this sort of historical work of Liebig or historical conception of Marx, but rather this constant interplay between these two things, and really conceiving of where Marx is trying to understand, what we're trying to study necessarily, in this sense, and how he uses these, scientists or theorists, or reacts to them thereof. So this is not a sort of passive acceptance of their theories, but rather this ongoing kind of interplay, and him always being very critical of them as whether bourgeois scientists or technological optimism. So I think the real, changing point was in the 7th edition of Agricultural Chemistry, Justus von Liebig. So he's been really understanding these non-proportional increases and understanding why these diminishing returns are actually occurring. And he starts developing this theory of the law of minimum, the necessity of replenishing these nutrients to the soil. And in this sense, he develops this conception of robbery agriculture, understanding how capitalism itself is robbing the soil of its nutrients. And this begins, I think, a critique too of capitalist productive forces, where Liebig explicitly says, this isn't really productive in any sense. This isn't technology. This is just pure robbery of soils. the capitalists are just, pretty much robbing these soils of their nutrients to get the maximum, crop load and just leaving devastation of erosion, desertification, etc. And then the sort of internationalization of this metabolic rift in the sense of robbing the battlefields of the Napoleonic Wars onwards and robbing these guano islands of their fertility in order to maintain this constant cycle of production and intensification thereof. So you start seeing, on the one hand, this increasing globalization of this metabolic rift in the sense of these capitalists are just robbing the soil of their nutrients to maintain their production, exporting it to the cities. And there in the cities, it's becoming, just waste in the rivers, causing eutrophication, causing the outbreak of, these diseases, cholera, tuberculosis, etc. And in this sense, you start having this critique thereof, the scientific validity of Marx's conception of the, town and country contradiction. And again, this real understanding of the sort of negative development of productive forces under capitalism and how, capitalism metabolism structurally dominates and causes this irrationality and just destruction. Meanwhile, wars are raging across the Americas for guano as they're trying to find a way to maintain this fertility, and colonies are being robbed of their food as well. Or you can go into the entire critique of like world systems theory and the long 16th century, but we'll leave that be for now.
I think that points to a sort of overarching question, which is the question of degrowth versus sustainable growth in a way, right? So if implicit in that is the idea that there is a natural limit to production, and that, we have exceeded that limit by artificial means, thereby exhausting the soils and depleting these resources, whatever they may be, and exploiting populations of human and non-human animals and exhausting the climate and so on, right? So that's one side of that question. The other side of that question, which is the one that I would tend to try to fall upon, is the idea that, in fact, the question is not degrowth versus capitalist excess, but that, in fact, there are ways to manage our reliance upon ecology simply because we are part of the ecological circle, which create added value without exploiting to the point of exhaustion soils and natural resources and human and non-human natures. Does that make sense? Like, I think that the answer to this is not degrowth, I guess is what I'm getting at, but it's also not fully automated luxury space communism.
So in a way, I do wonder if this is an exact point whenever Saito's reconstruction of Marx is so necessary and so radical in its implications, because it gets us out of that distinction, right? Or that dichotomy of degrowth versus, fully automated luxury communism, whatever that might mean. So in a way, I was curious for y'all, do you see that this is in some way, Saito ends his book with saying, Marx lives. And I wonder if this is a precise intellectual location or sort of theoretical location of where Marx precisely has to be, not jettisoned, but sort of brought back as this living, breathing force in how we think about these questions.
Yeah, for sure. I want to bracket too, like Saito points this out very clearly, that this like serious engagement with Liebig and this robbery agriculture didn't occur until like the drafting of, a manuscript of Capital Volume 3. This was very, very late in the game. 65, this is what, 15 years, 18 years before his death. This is I think it gives, again, this vitality to Marx's critique and this ongoing, developing critique, which is really necessary, I think, now for refounding and continuing to develop ecological Marxism today, very simply.
Maybe a couple of quick points I wanted to just tag on to discussion that you both have just had is, I think whenever we're talking about what's typically called the law of diminishing returns, a la Ricardo, one of the things I think that Marx's sort of use of Liebig and his understanding of the sort of reification of capital and what it is doing with the robbery of soil and nitrogen and the agricultural process is that the law of diminishing returns is, again, not sort of this like universal tendency, but it is a very specific expression of capital's contradictions about its reified relation of humanity to nature and this metabolic process, and the way that it pushes it to this point of irrationality. So for me, I thought that was actually kind of a novel thing I'd never really thought about in that way, of how, the law of diminishing returns isn't this like trans-historical sort of process per se. It's a very specific effect of capital's particular reification of the metabolic rift, or the metabolic process, or however you want to think about that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, he establishes this sort of like causality between, the metabolism of the capitalist mode of production and the sort of, of course, destruction of deterioration of, fertile lands. And this is not a recourse now to Malthus, but it's the sort of like third way forward, where it's like, okay, yes, this is occurring, but this is a very clear causality of how we do this and what exactly capitalism is doing, how it's developing the productive forces, and how it's just so rational in how it treats this. And it's kind of foreclosing, if you treat this, law of diminishing returns seriously, any way forward.
And I think the other key thing that you kind of hit on too, Niko, about the sort of annexation of the Chincha Islands and the sort of imperialist expansion across Peru for, these guano deposits as they were being depleted, is just that, a la Luxembourg, the idea and the accumulation of capital, her sort of seminal work, which again is like considered a still early development of a sort of anti-imperialist critique of capital's development, is not just that imperialist expansion under capitalism has to happen to sort of break open new markets for preventing a crisis of underconsumption or overproduction, but it's also about the necessity of finding new deposits of natural resources to allow this particular exchange or metabolic, devastating, irrational process of metabolic exchange to continue. So for me, it was a way to just put this kind of materialist element to, I think, a commonsensical critique, I would dare say, for a lot of Marxists about like, what is the nature of imperialism? So for me, it was kind of an interesting layer to add on to this about that specific example. I have to be honest, my favorite part of the whole book was the discussion about the annexation of the Chincha Islands. I just thought that was phenomenal and kind of blew my mind apart a little bit.
Oh, there's an entire like series of papers by Foster and Burkett. If you're loving that, that's their main thing.
Inject that right into my eyeballs. That's what I'm advocating for.
If I could harken back to more, I mean, this sort of conceptualization of, exploitation and appropriation, to understanding how, the productive forces technologies are going in this regard, that really harkens back to Moore's conceptualization of geopower, and again, this sort of constellation of forces that are in place to actually exploit nature and really structurally point sciences and even our social organization to extract and exploit and find new reserves of labor, whether human or extra-human.
So can I ask you guys this? Since you clearly understand this shit pretty well, much better than I do, here's a question. Would it be possible through the conscious collaboration of the associated producers to arrange a mode of metabolism which was sustainable?
That's the hope. I mean, do we want to segue then into Fraas, or what do you say, Adam?
Yeah, I think that was also a pro podcaster move that Comrade Remi just did. So I think that is exactly a perfect pivot point into the final chapter on Marx's ecology after 1868 and Fraas for sure. So I don't know, Niko, do you want to go ahead and kind of an overview of Fraas here? I mean, this is your shit, so by all means, go for it.
Hell yeah. So I think one of my favorite ways to understand this is Marx is continuing to develop his his theories, draw upon Liebig's latest work, really studying agricultural chemistry in seriousness and the debates that are ongoing. And during the famous Herr Düring of the Anti-Düring fame, written by Engels, he starts taking up a lot of Liebig's ideas. And Marx like that can't be right. Essentially, I can't draw on the same guy here. I want to read what the critics are saying. I can't take upon Liebig uncritically. Enemy of sorts is doing the same. Clearly, we need to go forward with this critique. He starts looking at this and he realizes the sort of political implications of robbery agriculture and this very again, if I mentioned previously, Justus von Liebig is a capitalist. He has his factories. He's trying to put forward this, mineral theory of productivity of agriculture and fertility. And his whole thing is, these nutrients aren't being returned to the soils. So what better thing can be done than providing this certainly specifically tailored, manures or fertilizers to the soils? And I can tell you that. He starts almost as he goes on, becoming more and more disillusioned with how agriculture is being conducted under capitalism. And in Marx's view, he lapses into Malthusianism. He kind of gives this like a backdoor to this sort of Malthusian view of, nature through this robbery agriculture. And Marx is, here trying to find a way to go forward without lapsing into sort of Prometheanism, or alternatively allowing this sort of horrible view of the future and the sort of, rejection of any kind of better society to become hegemonic. So enter Fraas. So Fraas, he is kind of like a colleague or collaborator with Liebig. He really admires Liebig's works, but he says, no, I want to continue Justus von Liebig's mineral theory of agriculture, but I want to combine with it here this sort of physics of sorts, agricultural physics, let's call it that. And he says this is the kind of new horizon of agriculture itself and understanding these sort of natural processes of nature. And I think this too kind of coincides, or at least kind of preempts, Marx's ethnographical kind of like studies. So here you have this sort of agricultural physics approach that focuses on the meteorological and the climatic effects of on soil formation and agriculture itself. And he says, hey, like against Liebig's kind of understanding of the central world agriculture and this destruction of nature in the past, we'll start looking more so at this sustainable agriculture previously under traditional ecological knowledge, if you will, and understand further how certain nature maintains this productivity without it collapsing and diminishing returns. It's really understanding this actual universal metabolism of nature as being maintenance of life, and actually being able to kind of push back this sort of diminishing view that Liebig is putting forward that can only be corrected by returning the nutrients to the soil via his fertilizers. So this really develops, I think, a new horizon for the metabolic approach in conjunction with Fraus's conceptualization of humanity's role in local kind of climate change, in the sense of how humans cut down the force, modify the local climates through the natural forces of evapotranspiration processes, sort of modulating the climates thereof. And it presents a much more, I think, in tune perspective for the 21st century ecological Marxist critique, in really harkening back to how we can utilize these natural forces and really kind of mimic, if you will, or if you want to use a more Promethean term, control or direct these natural forces to maintain productivity, instead of relying upon this very modernist science that thinks only humans can do it. But no. That nature has its own its own forces, its own agency.
So what I'm hearing is the condoms are returning to the pizza. Nature is healing.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed.
To add on just a couple of quick points to that excellent summary that you just gave, Comrade Niko, too, is I think that in terms of answering your question as well, Remi, I mean, I think that to me, one of the things that Saito lays out is that it is possible to create this sustainable metabolic sort of relationship, but it has to be a conscious one. It can't be an unconscious one. I have a note here where he says that human labor alters the metabolic processes through conscious and purposeful interaction in terms of agriculture and industry. But there's an unconscious way that the effects of that metabolic exchange really sort of affect not only nature, but humanity as a whole. I think this distinction between sort of a conscious tendency and an unconscious tendency is a really interesting one. Not only just in terms of eco-socialist sorts of perspectives or an eco-Marxist perspective, but also thinking about, again, some of our work around the nature of the unconscious in terms of psychoanalytic critiques as well. So I really find it interesting that Saito doesn't really talk about that very much, but is clearly thinking about the distinction between conscious and unconscious effects and processes that are occurring. And I mean, at least for Saito, he says that for Marx and his reconstruction, that Marx thinks it is possible and necessary to harmonize civilization and nature through what he calls collective governance of metabolism by the associated producers. And I just have a very big note that says, ha ha ha, communism time. That's my real dumb guy shit. That's how I summarize things.
I love that note. I saw that and I was just giggling to myself.
Yeah. I do that sometimes. I just drop that in to remember that, like, oh yeah, this is a real thing. And that's just how I relate to this material. I mean, the real key here, if we're going to answer this question of, is it possible to create a sustainable metabolic interaction, is that it has to be consciously arranged. And I think Saito has a really interesting point drawing on Marx, is to say that this process has never been consciously arranged. Maybe because of the limits, like you were saying earlier, Niko, of the way that the production has always been chained to the reliance on animal life being involved in the labor process. But in capital and in an industrial production, that has become unchained. And so if it is going to be sustainable, it has to be one that I think for Saito, just to kind of maybe bring us to a conclusion here, has to be consciously arranged in a rational way, that we have to understand that there are limits and that technological innovation can help us maybe shape those limits or change this interaction, but there are still limits. And it has to be one where we take control consciously of that interaction and not allow it to be unconsciously destroyed in the way that capital's sort of abstracted, reified social forms tend to push it into that realm.
Yeah, I was also very impressed in between these last two chapters, again, how Saito really lays out how Marx conceives of like these kind of like conceptions of imperialism, whether in Ireland or in India, his main kind of like areas of critique here. But he even has a quote here about animal rights and this sort of like industrial agricultural system, which I had never seen before. I believe it's from one of his notes, again, here in the Mega project, about how, like, this kind of prisons the animals are born into and the sort of just deterioration of life forces. It's just a very much hand in hand of the exploitation, just destruction and deterioration of life, whether human or extra-human. It's just these things go hand in hand on this logic of capital. It's very mature. I did not expect to get this much out of, like, Marx's work in this regard being 150 years ago. This is such a mature work.
Zaddy Marx was truly ahead of his time.
It's consonant with the rest of the Marxist project, which is to say that at a certain level of abstraction, the entire communist project is the idea of history, meaning the history of humankind, becoming aware of itself for the first time and seizing control of its own historical development for the first time, which was never possible before the possibility of a universal subject in the form of the proletariat. So, like, not to get all pamphlet brain on folks, but on the other hand, I think that it's entailed in the scientific socialist framework that we would, of course, have to include humanity's relation with nature in a truly emancipatory project and a truly emancipatory frame, right? That wouldn't be secondary or tertiary or an unintended consequence. That would have to be part of it for us to achieve true liberation as human beings and as producers and as equals. So I think that the project of going back into Marx and teasing out the implication, whether it was explicit or not, within Marx, that our relation to nature and our metabolic structure is a central piece of our ability to find emancipation for human beings. That's an advancement. That's a development and an innovation in Marxism. And I honestly, I couldn't be happier to be talking about it.
I guess one last thing I want to kind of tag here, and maybe this will bring us to closing thoughts and critiques or criticisms of Saito as well, is, I've been getting knee deep in debates about whether there is a teleological element within Marx that is typically associated with him being Promethean, being anthropomorphic in his understanding. And I think that this sort of ecological element that Saito is really trying to salvage out of Marx is precisely one of the places that really sharpens this sort of critique that Marx is not teleological the way that he's typically thought about in these sort of, I think, pretty simplistic, limited understandings of Marx's corpus of work. I think the idea that the goal here is not to say that there is a complete advancement or this sort of utopian idyllic future that Marx is aiming for is directly contradicted by Saito's reconstruction, which is to say that Marx's project isn't to abolish technological or abolish natural limits through technological innovation. It's simply to say we have to be able to gain some sort of rational control over this metabolic process. And it isn't sort of, this is, I think, a really key distinction of Marx, which just glossed over quite a bit. Marx isn't saying that there's an end to history. He's saying we're going to move out of prehistory into history for the first time. And again, that isn't sort of an idea that the process stops, that dialectical sort of developments and tensions and contradictions end. It's just to say that we're trying to get to the place where we're going to have an active agential force in history as maybe a collective subject for the first time. This sort of us working on Saito together has been a real place that I've solidified my thinking on that, precisely because this way that Marx understood the metabolic process is not something that ever ends. It's just a way to like try to manage the process with this sort of conscious taking up of history for the first time.
Well, just like biological evolution, social evolution is directionless. There's no such thing as moving towards progress or moving toward, right? There is such a thing as entropy. We can move towards a greater or lesser degree of organization, but it's value neutral and it's not ascriptive in any sense, right? So like, same with biological evolution. So it is just moving in a direction of self-propagation and autocatalytic development. And the same is true of history, in my view. The difference here is that in the realm of history, and by description, in the realm of human evolution, there's an opportunity for conscious direction and control of that, right? So that's the fundamental difference, right? So like entropy does not have an agent or a subject behind it. It just simply is. Whereas social evolution, in fact, does. And so in this and possibly only this realm of material being, there's an opportunity to introduce subjectivity and to marry it to objectivity and to self-consciously direct history in that way. And so the Prometheanism of the project is not crude productivism and smokestack socialism and just a Cartesian desire to dominate the non-human world. Instead, it's a self-conscious capacity to consciously direct human society in an egalitarian and progressive way, which in fact entails the interaction with nature being one of understood holism and one of reciprocity and balance. And that may sound utopian or spiritual or whatever you want it to sound, but like that's ultimately the communist project, right? Is that the human subject collectively, for the first time in history, is able to take hold of its mode of society and able to universalize its condition and control the passage and the course of its history. And that project is not separate and apart from the project to create a sustainable and balanced and harmonious interaction and metabolism with non-human natures. In fact, it's inextricably bound up with it. And that's the communist project.
For sure. I mean, I think another thing I really got from this was, in the same sense you were saying before, Adam, about the purposeful, conscious and unconscious dimensions of this human social metabolism. His conception here of elasticity and then the complete malfunction, taking a kind of note of material science here, the kind of hubris of the extent to which we are able to modify nature, to the extent the elasticity and the uncertainties about the kind of complete malfunction, if you want to use those terminologies here, with Fraus's work, as he highlights here, really opens the way to a kind of decentered, almost human subject too, in the true, I think, bringing in natural history in this kind of Darwinist before Darwin, as Marx calls him, for Fraus, natural history and human history, and really understanding too, almost, maybe I'm reading too much into this, but a kind of a half century prior conceptualization of this sort of Gaian theory or kind of biospheric theory of how this feedback loop of biodiversity, life itself, begets more life and kind of maintains these processes. By understanding this sort of kind of natural force here, I think the term Fraus uses, like that natural forces, by harnessing them, by truly understanding these things, it offers a way forward that's not really lapsing into this really vulgar Malthusianism. And also, too, you see this direct continuity with Marx's later works, although that's the one issue with this book here, I think, is that, it's very limited to one period of notebooks and some of the previous work in Mega. There's still ongoing work in this fourth volume. And truly, I think, understanding where Marx goes towards his death, essentially, and this simultaneity of his research on, geology and his research onto, continuing into agricultural work and kind of pro-ecological disciplines at the same time as his like ethnological notebooks, understanding these pre-capital societies and really seeing this way forward that doesn't have to go through this possibly destructive, possibly the end of human society, in the sense he writes in his last few works on geology, this sort of throwing off of humans from Earth due to our deterioration entirely of this, universal metabolism of nature. This attempt, it seems, towards the end of his life to really conceptualize of a way beyond this, Western teleological view of dominance, I guess a victory of communism or victory of, modernity, really seeing how we can both maintain the sciences and this major developments we made here, both without going through this very, very destructive path. And I wish we had this, a century ago.
Well, maybe on this note, I want to maybe just share any like final criticisms, whether sort of our own or just other responses to Saito's work, and just as maybe a good pivot point to wrap up.
Yeah, sure, that's right.
I know we kind of drew on a couple of different sources. One of the things that, we mentioned earlier, just very briefly, Slavoj Žižek has kind of talked a little bit recently about some of his writing that he's done in response to Saito. And kind of my very summary of Žižek's criticism is just that, as opposed to this understanding of like humanity as part of nature, seeing that increasingly we have to understand that humanity is like actively shaping nature, and how we define that dichotomy is sort of developing in new ways that are like based in technology and role of genetics and everything else. So, I don't know how much we want to like delve into this, but I have to tell you, I read Žižek's article that we shared a little bit amongst ourselves, and I'm still a hard Žižek fan. I should say Žižek stan, I guess. But I was even still just like, yeah, I don't know. This still sounds like kind of a hot take, and I'm not sure how much this really adds to my like critical reading of Saito, is just to think about, oh yes, like humanity is also shaping nature as we understand in a different way. So I was curious if y'all had any thoughts about the Žižek article.
So I think his really provocative ending here is that there's no return to this authentic feeling of our unity with nature, but the only way to confront these challenges of, ecology and this sort of multi-crisis is to accept fully the radical denaturalization of nature. It's provocative. It's very provocative. So, I guess the whole thing I get from it is, what's your, definition of nature? The sort of like very semantic, issue taking with it. But I do think here, I don't think he really got from this last chapter on Fraas really what Marx was going for. But I also did read a lot more of like, various articles from this mega project that have been released in the kind of meantime. And the main collaborator of Saito, he wrote some articles too about, this sort of some of the later works here. I think here you really see, in this sense, the work of his in these ethnological notebooks in continuity with, as I said before, his research on this, it's not a matter of this sort of what Žižek argues about this traditional wisdom and how he seems to have this very Promethean, or I guess very like modernist impulse still from my reading of this. And he really doesn't understand, again, this sort of agency of nature. That's my, I guess, huge issue of it. And it's a sort of, this kind of hubris, I think, coming from the sort of elasticity of nature to the extent you think we can actually modify nature. It's, I think, one of the issues with a lot of this social approaches to nature itself, where you kind of like formally subsume nature to human sociality through to like our technological progress, but without really understanding, again, how limited this is, and the sort of broader biophysical or sort of, Earth system's history, the conception of it.
Yeah, I think that's actually a really good response to some of Žižek's criticisms, although I am like pretty sympathetic to certain points he makes in that particular article. But I do think kind of what you're saying, Niko, is like pretty spot on, that it is also like pretty clearly maybe not grounded in this history of all of these different perspectives and the development of these ideas and frameworks around understanding nature and humanity's relationship to it. And so, yeah, maybe in certain ways, like technological progress will allow us to shape our relation to nature in certain ways. But again, it's kind of leaving out these huge spots in the other sort of ways that we relate to nature, and sort of understanding it as like a much bigger holistic process versus whether, we can alter like genetic expression through medical technologies and things like that. All that being said, I am very sympathetic to the idea of there is no like holistic idyllic return to nature. But the idea of like there is a nature that is completely separate from us, and reinforcing that dichotomy like is in itself something that only we can conceptualize like in the place of like capitalist modernist sorts of ways of seeing the world themselves. So I feel like I'm sympathetic to that, but also understanding that like Zizek might be missing a hell of a lot of different things from his critique of Saito in that way.
For sure. I mean, I guess there is no return to authentic, nature, but I think at the same time we never left nature. It's more so how limited, again, this hubris that I think that's just so predominant in a lot of people who just have not studied earth system science. You know what I mean? Like, I think that's where I love kind of the Morean approach of just this like co-constitution. Although to, I guess, minor criticism or more, like the lack of some of this side here, the actual biophysical or system kind of scientific approach, but he still has I think the analytical framework to include it in, this monism in the sense. I just don't like how condescending it seemed like, this kind of two poles that Zizek sets up between this scientific technological civilization and this sort of like, pre-modern wisdom, and how like one is controlled by capitalism and the other is, it just seems to me that he cites too much more on this modernist like knowledge.
Can I get a big yeah, unbelievable, incalculable amount of gratitude and respect and honor and big solidarity energy over to our podrads at Cosmopod and Comrades Niko and Remi in particular. This was a hell of a lot of fun. I think it is a very, very special and unique and important episode in the Red Library catalog, and we are immensely honored and thankful we get to bring this particular content out to all you Comrade listeners across the globe. And if my Chairman Bane instincts can be trusted, it does not seem that this will be the only collaborative episode we do in the Ecology Cast series over at Cosmopod. So keep your eyes, ears, and third eyes peeled for more of the same coming up soon. That's really it, y'all. I think we're just going to get out of here. We're shutting down the podcast machines, close the doors to the podcast factory, and we're ready to go home. We're ready to crack open a cold one, maybe watch some Married with Children. That's a deep cut. Gonna sit in our recliners, gonna kick the shoes off, gonna relax, and just reflect and savor the critical questions, the icy cold takes, the spicy hot analysis, and get a little bit of rest. Because I have a feeling we're about to be in the golden age of Red Library. We have some amazing guests coming up, we have some amazing episodes, some amazing books, we have some new very exciting projects in the works from your Red Troika boys over here. Until we see you back here next week, take care of yourselves, stay hydrated, stay motivated, stay liberated, keep searching for ways to be emancipated, keep breaking down that subject-object divide, keep critically deconstructing the barrier between humanity and nature, and even though the world's on fire, quite literally, remember, your comrades over here at Red Library, we out here. We ain't going anywhere. We're sending you solidarity, love, and big Chairman Bane energy, wherever you're at, all across the globe. Red Library's out. Peace.